Ask a quick question, Neil. I just wondered, you're talking about kind of financial forecasting. Obviously, we've been in a period of kind of political and economic uncertainty for the last couple of years. Is that something as a practice that do you take the kind of global picture into account as well in your kind of financial forecasting?
The easy answer is it depends. Of course, it always does depend. I mean, specifically in the case of Grimshaw, for instance, because of the nature of our business, which is all about large-scale projects, it's all about yes/no decisions on things like third runway or HS2. There's probably no single indicator in terms of the economic climate that I would build into my forecast, because it's more about building up my project-by-project forecasts or projections. Whereas if you're in a business which is maybe more focused on the residential market or the social housing market, then you're clearly going to be much more driven by, it's a volume game, and you're much more vulnerable and affected by changes in the macro or microeconomic climate. So things like interest rates or things like political decisions to push in the direction of social housing or not.
Thank you. Any questions from the floor? We've got one at the front here.
Thank you. A question is, you gave a lot of examples in your talk about how you've kind of broken the rules, smuggled something to the UN camp, you took a political stance potentially against the leader of the United States. My question is how, and you've justified that with quite, strong, powerful social reasoning. You're doing good to the world in general. But what stops another quite powerful corporation or another tech company of taking the same stance, saying we're breaking the rules, we're doing social good, but actually not doing that and influencing the world in a certain way, or advantaging a small number of people against a large number of people? And the simple question is, do you have a kind of a self-check mechanism within Airbnb? It's all well and good saying we're going to do good, we're going to connect the world, we're going to do all these great things. Do you then do something and sit back and say, did that actually work? Was that actually good? Is that actually, because if you're challenging the power of government, who then kind of regulates what Airbnb or Google or Microsoft do?
No, you missed out the important one, which is Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. But I think the tech companies, so it's going to sound very weird to say, but so I was talking about this earlier. I just was in Oxford and seeing these Christopher Wren buildings. And, in the 14th, 15th, 16th century, the church was basically the benefactor of architects, and then it became. We went through a whole series where then it became museums, and then it became. And actually, the tech companies are now becoming the benefactors of architecture as well. It's interesting to see architects now working for and with tech companies. But tech companies are, at the moment, a growing industry that has heavy influence in a lot of different pies and actually shaping a lot of communities. The way that our team works is we have core projects, and then we have pilots, research, and experimentations. Those pilots and experimentations are only 6 to 9 months. And at the end of those 6 to 9 months, we do a check. Is it doing good for the world? Is it doing good for the community? Is it making a social impact? Is it negatively affecting certain peoples in the community? And so we do have internal systems in place. We also have something called the media, which certainly puts us in check. So when Airbnb comes out and says we're going to house 100,000 people over the next 5 years, a lot of media professionals will say, okay, we're going to remember that. Because if we come around in 5 years' time and you guys are not making substantial effort towards doing that, then were you just doing this in order to get publicity, or were you not doing it for the right reasons? So in a way, the media actually is a good thing to keep tech companies in check in making that commitments on social promise. There's been a lot of tech companies that have said they're going to do X or Y, solve clean water, create energy for Africa, and then 6 months later, suddenly they've got a change in leadership and those projects are shelved. So that's a sub to Thailand, sort of thing. I think, at the moment, a lot of the tech companies are taking a very open border approach, and we're living in a world where we have political forces that are focused on kind of much more nationalistic and closed border societies. And so you're having this friction between the two. The question is, at what point does an open border, open internet system allow for bad actors? And what responsibility do we as the tech industry have to keep in check our other people, right? What's interesting about the Facebook and the Cambridge Analytica issue is, where were the other tech leaders to say, hey, that's out of line, right? When Uber was having issues around gender issues, where were the other tech leaders saying, this is wrong, and we want to stand up against this? So I think one thing that the tech industry needs to do going forward is not just keep itself in check, but keep its compatriots in check, right? Because I think if people knew what Cambridge Analytica was doing, if you were in Silicon Valley, you knew what was happening, right? It's hard to pretend that there were forces in play, for elections, not just the U.S., but let's look at other elections around the world. And for we're all friends. We all know each other. We go to the same bars. We go to the same restaurants. People talk, right? And for not to be able to stand up and say, actually, I think this is a wrong thing for our industry to be doing. So again, I think we actually have a responsibility to keep others in check. And so that's a bigger issue. But the future of democracy kind of depends on these kind of both internal and external mechanisms before government regulates it. And usually they overregulate.
Thank you, Cameron. We've got one other question in the middle of the floor here. The microphone's just coming around.
Is this on? Yeah. My question's for Neil. I was just wondering about sort of large-scale projects and the way you forecast, because, practices, they quite often front-end their fees for the design end, but then obviously the delivery can take an awful lot longer than you expect. There can be an awful lot of complications, and the client quite often then just expects that fee to just be, already included. And the sort of amount of added value, especially in sort of where we do live in a society where there is so much legislation, there's so much that an architect has to take on board beyond when you get it past planning, and you sort of and how you cope with that when you might get up to planning in the first year and it might take another 5 years or 10 years to actually build something.
Yeah. Okay. So I'd say three things in response to that. The first is. Cash is king, therefore front-loaded fees are good. Yeah, so bring the money in as quickly as you can is always a good thing. Second thing though is honesty and transparency in your forecasts and being realistic. I think every budget I've ever seen since I've been in Grimshaw will have been understated in terms of resources by at least 20%. Okay, people just estimate the amount of time it's going to take to deliver. You have to be honest. Ultimately, it's in your own interest to be honest about how much time you're going to be applying to delivering the job. The third thing, the critical thing, is about scope of work and variations. And I think this is where architects need to become a hell of a lot cleverer in terms of their financial management. Not really the theme today, because it's more about, I guess, commercial management rather than how to manage from a financial perspective. But being paid for what you do. Okay, whenever you go outside scope of work for whatever reason, because you're doing something extra, because you're redrawing, or because there's a prolongation, you need to make sure you're paid for it. And the only way you're going to get paid for it is by saying, stop, right up front. Okay, we will carry on and do this, but this is outside our scope, this is outside the original contract, therefore we need to negotiate separate fees. What architects do the whole time is they carry on because they're obsessed with delivering the project, rightly so. That's the driver, it's the project, not the contract. They carry on, they do their utmost, they work through the night to deliver, and then potentially we go back to the client and ask for more money, by which time it's far too late. Okay.
So in that, with the whole resourcing, and we end up under-resourcing by about 20%, does that mean your profit loss, if you're expecting 70-30 to begin with, on the costs versus the profit, then surely we're cutting out most of that profit by the end anyway?
Well, so that's where you need your CFO or your CFO equivalent to challenge and to understand sufficiently the business, but also to understand sufficiently financial management to be able to challenge and introduce element of prudence, element. Contingency is a great word which I thought about using today. I didn't want to expand too much, but any budget should have a contingency element to it. Things will go wrong. Shit happens, if I'm allowed to say that. There has to be a shit happens line in any budget, and then you work out your 30% based on that.
I think, unfortunately, we've run out of time for questions now, but it's possible that Neil and Cameron might be around in the coffee break if you want to grab them then. But before we do go to the coffee break, can we just thank our speakers this morning?